The following review for Antichamber will discuss the game in its entirety. You should be aware that much of the enjoyment in this game comes from figuring out the logic behind its various systems, so watching this video before playing the game is probably a bad idea. Antichamber released in 2013 for the PC and was almost entirely constructed as a one-man effort by Alexander Bruce. The path each player takes through Antichamber is going to be quite different, but ultimately there's 4 main bottlenecks the player is supposed to go through before the ending sequence. These choke points each present the player with a new gun, but before any of that happens, players just wander around the world of Antichamber for a while. This early phase of the game acts as a soft introduction to the basic mechanics, particularly the non-Euclidean space. For those not familiar with that term, it basically means that spaces don't always connect to each other logically. Since Antichamber features no cutscenes and no explanation at the start, it has to rely on other methods to acclimate the player to the environment. I found the first puzzle I ran across to be cleverly designed, not because it's difficult to solve, but because it's difficult to not solve. There's no way for the player to progress here other than going backwards, after which they'll realise that things may not always be what they appear in Antichamber. On paper, this seems like such a pointlessly simple situation that there's no point in including it at all, but it's less of a puzzle and more of a wordless tutorial. Of course, players can press the escape key to jump back out of any situation, but they probably won't know that until afterwards. This kind of space manipulation isn't exactly a new trick, but I'm not sure I've ever seen a game utilise it as much as Antichamber. On a technical level, this is easily the best implementation of these kinds of transitions that I've ever seen. Everything feels very smooth, and I was particularly impressed by the viewports that seamlessly swap the player from one location to the next. That said, with the exception of the aforementioned viewports, it's hard to say what the non-Euclidean design adds to the game. There is a certain atmosphere gained from the confusion this can cause, but as a puzzle mechanic it's almost entirely worthless. Predictable interactions are especially beneficial to puzzle games, but traversing the environment of the game is, at times, completely unpredictable. Turning a corner might not go where you expect, falling into a hole might bring you to an entirely new place. These unpredictable events may have had some value if not for the map screen, which allows the player to jump around at will. Without the map, it might have taken some memorization to navigate the environment, but as the game is now, it doesn't. You just sort of wander around from one place to the next. If you end up somewhere unexpected, you can just warp back to try walking the other way instead, and if you can't solve a puzzle, you can just go to the map until you find somewhere that works. It's also interesting to note how the non-Euclidean design of the map feels as though it would have been very complicated to design when in fact the opposite is probably true. If the game had used more traditional space, then every area would have to be carefully designed to only connect to other viable areas. In other words, stopping players from bringing blocks to the wrong place or skipping rooms. As it is, Antichamber is free to block off or connect areas at a whim, which makes the overall picture much easier to design. I hate to criticize all the spatial trickery because it's done so well, but it doesn't present many puzzle situations that couldn't also be accomplished with normal 3-dimensional space. Since the whole game is one big level, a more simplistic, predictable environment might have presented opportunities to implement more difficult challenges, like bringing blocks from point A to point B a few rooms away. You might think, with no strong landmarks to guide the player around the minimalistic environment, that this sounds like a really poor idea. But here's where I have another point. In one of the rooms in the game, we'll call it the life room, there's a bunch of boxes with colourful displays in them. It's an interesting room in its own right, even though it has no puzzles. It's like having an art exhibition tucked away inside the game, but I'm not convinced piling all of these into one room was a good use for them, when they could have been used to break up the otherwise sparse visuals. It's easy to see how these could have functioned as landmarks to anchor the player. I'm curious if the life room exhibits were initially supposed to be used instead of the little placards that are currently in place. It seems to me like some of the exhibits have a couple of similarities to some of the signs, but I might just be reading too much into things. I wish this had been the case, however, as I found the goofy illustrations and accompanying platitudes to be in stark contrast with the sleek, abstract visuals. Almost nothing else in the game seems to mirror reality. For all anyone knows, we're just a floating ball of energy moving around. But these little pictures have silly drawings of humans on them for some reason. It doesn't mesh well, but at least it's pretty non-intrusive. Apart from those placards, the minimalistic visuals are very well done, with some nice attention to detail in parts. The visual design of the block guns in particular is extremely intuitive, letting the player know how much ammo they have by simply showing it to them. There's a need for the player to be able to tell the difference between 4 and 5 blocks, but not so much when they reach higher numbers, so this way of presenting ammo works perfectly. I also like the way the colour-coded blocks indicate what level of gun the player will need to solve each particular puzzle. Such simplistic visuals run the danger of coming across as lazy, but it never really felt that way to me. Apart from some unfortunate texture stretching in places, everything looks surprisingly crisp and professional. It was a great decision to go for this kind of style, since it meant that Alexander could focus on the layout of the world itself rather than the window dressing, and in retrospect it's hard to imagine Antichamber looking any other way. The abstract visuals also contribute to the gameplay by circumventing preconceptions the player might have about certain objects. Figuring out the various gameplay elements requires more lateral thinking than they would if they had been contextualized using real-world objects. As a result, it ends up feeling more rewarding. While the topsy-turvy level design may not have been quite to my taste, I have to respect how the warp screen keeps the pacing even, by allowing the player to instantly swap between different puzzles until they figure one out. Even with this in place, my first playthrough took around 6 hours to complete, which was lengthier than I was expecting, although some of that time was only wasted because I missed one of the button prompts explaining the controls. I can't fault it for the amount of content, especially for a cheap one-man project, but most of my favourite parts of Antichamber happened early on. It's at that point where a few different puzzle elements make themselves clear without much prompting, the kinetic balls, viewports and portholes probably being the best examples. Unfortunately, while these elements carry on further into the game, the later additions all centre around the blocks and block-based puzzles. After the first phase of the game, the guns completely steal the focus, and the other elements take on a secondary role. This means that 3/4 of the game is built on similarly styled puzzles. It's at this stage that Antichamber trades its trickery for more predictable gameplay mechanics, which makes for better, more intricate puzzles, but robs the game of its initial intriguing premise. If it had sold itself as a block puzzler, which it largely is, then I'm not sure it would have garnered nearly as much interest or praise. No amount of window dressing will change the fact that large chunks of the game are spent looking at blocks on a wall to unlock a nearby door. For what it's worth, I think the block puzzles on display are actually pretty good. The green and yellow guns in particular are where these hit their peak. The fact that more blocks can be created by making an empty square is exploited in virtually every way imaginable, and pulling the blocks around, while sometimes cumbersome, is also used in a variety of ways. The blue gun isn't as interesting as the later ones, but I suppose it should get a pass since it's more of an introduction. At its worst, players use the blue gun simply to create stairs or a bridge, which can be an incredibly boring and finicky experience. So much so it left me with the impression that I wasn't even solving some of these puzzles correctly. On the other hand, the way the blocks can be used to change the behaviour of the bouncy floors is great. It feels like a natural evolution of both of those elements. The lasers that control the doors were also obviously designed to play well with the block guns, which creates a few clever scenarios. The problem is, apart from those aforementioned examples, the block guns don't interact with the other gameplay mechanics. They have no way of interacting with the viewports, the kinetic balls, portholes, disappearing walls, or any of the once-off tricks the game has up its sleeve. Too many of the block puzzles are simply embedded into the wall, detached from everything else. It feels like they fail to capitalise on what the game has going for it. I mean, there's a large, three-dimensional, interconnected map out there, but a lot of the game is spent stationary, staring at two-dimensional puzzles on the walls. While the early game was very memorable, the rest of Antichamber bleeds together in my memory as a series of very similar puzzles. Rounding out the series of upgrades is the red gun, which is the most disappointing of the bunch, since it doesn't add much meaningful functionality compared to the others. Thankfully, although the red gun doesn't open up many more possibilities, the final set of challenges does a pretty good job of closing out the game. It's a linear trip down all the game's mechanics, forcing the players to utilise everything they've learned so far to make it to the end. This is undermined a little by the very end itself, where the black cube seems to foreshadow something, but ultimately doesn't amount to much. I wasn't expecting a boss fight, since it's a puzzle game and nothing introduced so far gave any indication a boss even could be fought at all with the player's limited moveset. But thanks to the build-up, I was expecting some kind of climactic encounter at the end, which the final sequence failed to deliver on. It plays up this expectation even into its final few seconds, when things start flying around the place and looking ominous, building up a lot of tension, only for the letters A and C to form in the air as if to say, "You played Antichamber, that's it, it's over, you can go home now." Occasionally, be it in a game or somewhere else, I'll come across a riddle that takes some lateral thinking to solve. You probably know the ones I mean, where the question seems misleading, but still makes sense in the end once you think about it. Antichamber is a lot like those, for better and worse. The first time going through, I was pleased both by the game's cleverness and my own ability to match it. When I started writing this review, I was expecting it to be mostly positive. Even though it didn't blow me away, my time with Antichamber was very enjoyable, and if nothing else, it's a very unique game. Unfortunately, just like those riddles I mentioned, the more I think about Antichamber, the less I like it. I get stuck thinking about whether the warped sense of space was just style where there could have been substance, or how the majority of the game focuses on block puzzles that barely take advantage of the setting. It seems like it just couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a straight up puzzle game or a weird exploration game. Rather than picking one and sticking to it, Antichamber tries to be both, but fails to mix them together in meaningful ways. The best way I can describe Antichamber is to say it's the sum of its parts. I mean that as both condemnation and praise. What's on display was enough to keep me entirely engaged for my first playthrough, even though it never quite came together to form something special. To anyone who has never played Antichamber, I'd happily recommend it. Despite its shortcomings, it's well worth experiencing, and you're unlikely to find anything else quite like it. To anyone who's played it already, take my advice and leave it alone for a while.